Well, welcome to part one of Parenting is Imperfect, a workshop offered by the University of Kentucky's Office of Work, Life, and Benefits. Today, we're going to be diving into some highlights and reflection based on the book, The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting by Brene Brown, Raising Children with Courage, Compassion, and Connection. So, in this session, we're going to start off by just a quick little overview of what are the parenting styles, just to kind of set some foundation and framework as you're thinking about these guideposts that we're going to talk through. Just having in mind what your own personal parenting styles are could be really helpful. We're going to look at some highlights from the book, The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting. We're going to talk about some of the guideposts and considerations that are offered in this book. And then we're going to offer opportunities to reflect on your own journey. So here are the guideposts that we're going to cover today. As I mentioned, this is a two-part series. This is part one. Part two will be next Tuesday. But in this part, these are the guideposts that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about cultivating worthiness in our families, shame versus guilt, and vulnerability. So let's jump right in. Parenting is imperfect. We all know that. You can ask any parent, and we will all say, yes, parenting is imperfect. We will all have those moments where you feel like, I am doing so great. And then you'll have those moments when you're like, oh gosh, I can't believe I just said that. Or, okay, my tone was not what I wanted it to be. And so you have those times where you are reminded that you are not a perfect parent. And our goal here is not to beat up on you because you're not a perfect parent. We're here to say that's the reality. That's just where we all live. None of us are perfect parents. All of us are doing the best we can one day at a time. So one thing to think about when you think about that, the fact that you're not a perfect parent, but you can still be a good parent, is that the most powerful and meaningful moments with your children happen in these imperfect moments. I love that. And one of the things that makes me think of is sometimes you have to laugh and not to cry. You guys ever had those moments where something happens and you just like, oh, you just laugh because you just don't want to cry. And it's an imperfect moment. Something happens and you just think, gosh, that did not go the way I planned in any kind of way. But sometimes those moments are so meaningful and so memorable. And those are the moments we tend to remember. And they're powerful oftentimes, especially if it's an opportunity where you allow yourself to be vulnerable with your child. Like if you make a mistake or you mess up something or you slip up, that could be a teachable moment for you and them. So those are powerful moments. And then most of us are in our homes just trying to do the best we can. I mean, there are lots of books on parenting. Oh my goodness, you can look on any bookstore, any shelf, and you'll find so many books about parenting tips and suggestions, and they all have their place, and they you can definitely pull some really great advice from those books. But at the end of the day, you are the parent that your child has. And you are doing the best you can based on your child and what they need, or your children and what they need. So there's no true instruction for your specific situation. There are some good resources. So you just kind of just have to give yourself permission to just do the best you can with the information you have. Even if you think about your parenting maybe 5 years ago versus today, you may be able to look back and say, you know what, I was doing the best I could then. And I know more now, and maybe your best looks different, and that's okay. And then also, no one is a parenting expert. Most of us feel vulnerable all the time. As a parent, you feel like, okay, I'm just trying my best, and I hope I don't mess up. And I hope I don't scar my child for life. Those kinds of things because of something you said or something you did or something you wish you said or wish you'd done. So here's a nice little quote from Dr. Brene Brown in the book. She said, who we are is a much more accurate predictor of how our children will do than what we know or understand about the science of parenting." So she's kind of saying, look, You can read all the books you can. You can read all the books on parenting, one-on-one, the science of parenting. You can try to understand all of that. But more than anything, like who you are to your child and what who you show up as with your child every single day, just you, that's kind of more than enough. So let's think about parenting styles. Most of us are familiar with these different parenting styles. And I want you to kind of think, what does your parenting style and influence have to do with it? Like, what does it have to do with you being a perfect parent? So, types of parenting styles. Here's the first one, authoritarian. The authoritarian theme, so to speak, is do it because I said so. That's sort of when you think of a strict parent, you're pretty much thinking about an authoritarian. This is the parent that says, did I tell you to do that? Go do it. Like, I don't want to hear any comments. I don't want any feedback, suggestions. I need you to obey because I said so. Sometimes that can be a little discouraging and it can be damaging to your bond with your child and your communication with your child, especially as they get older. We know that when little children, oftentimes you have to be a little more direct. As they get older, you have to be a little more open to listening and getting feedback from them. You still make the ultimate final decision, but they want to, they need to feel heard. And that's even as little children. So next is the permissive. And this is the parent that's kind of like you look and the child is just seemingly doing everything. And they're pretty indulgent. They have a lot of love for their child, so oftentimes they don't want to punish them. They don't want to let them feel the consequences of their behavior or their actions. Sometimes they don't have as many clear boundaries, or the boundaries that they have, they keep shifting them. Like the rule is this today and it changes tomorrow kind of thing. And that tends to be the permissive parent. And some people call it the fun parent, depending on who you're talking to. And then there's the uninvolved parent. This is the parent that's kind of like, look, they're a little neglectful. They may be very involved and engaged in their own life outside of their child, and whatever they have going on may be very, very consuming to them. And that might be impacting and causing them to be uninvolved. They may be like, leave me alone. They may be the parent that's in the house but not participating in a child's life, just not engaged. So they love the child, but they're just not involved. And then you have the authoritative parent. And this is the parent that tends to kind of work more with the child. Sometimes we consider them the nurturing parent. And they do have structure, they do have boundaries, but they oftentimes are willing to kind of adjust that as they go along, or listen to the child and offer and take in the child's advice and suggestions and concerns and make some adjustments accordingly. So those are the different types of parenting styles. So we want you to think, which one of these fit me? Which one of these parenting styles do I fall into? And here's some reflection questions that we're going to take a moment and think about here in just a moment. What is your primary parenting style of those four? Primary, meaning the one you're kind of go to most of the time. Do you ever utilize the other parenting styles? I wanted to ask that question because oftentimes we may use more than one parenting style. We may even use more than one parenting style depending on the child because you need to. You may use different parenting style depending on the ages of the children and the gaps. So if you have a child that's like 5 or 6 years older than another child, say a 16-year-old and a 10-year-old, you may be using different parenting styles because of their age gap and where they are in their development. The other question, do you use various styles for different children? And then how does your parenting styles impact you as an imperfect parent? How does your parenting styles impact you as an imperfect parent? So, thank you for taking some time to reflect on these questions, and we're going to move on to our next section. I put this point in here just to say breathe. I know that when you're starting to talk about something as close to all of us as your parenting and how well you're doing, if you're doing well, if you just had a bad day parenting, this can be tough to talk about. If you had an amazing day parenting, you may be like, I'm doing pretty good, you know. So just breathe. It's gonna be okay. All right, let's get into some of the goalposts from the book and just some of the things to consider. She talks about cultivating wholeheartedness. Wholeheartedness. And what does that mean? Here's a few points to think about. We cannot give our children what we don't have. How we raise our children and how we think about our families and our own lives impacts our parenting. So she makes the point of when you're trying to cultivate wholeheartedness and worthiness in your child, that if you don't feel worthy, if you don't feel whole yourself, then it's hard to build that in your child. It's hard to see that in your child. It's hard to encourage that in your child. So I think that's a really interesting foundational point. Like we're talking about, you're not perfect, but you're trying to do your best. And if you are already feeling kind of broken yourself or weary yourself, and you're trying to build some confidence in your child, and you may be coming from a place where you like, I don't even have confidence myself, and I'm trying to build confidence in my child. So that was kind of what she was saying. It's hard to build into your child what you don't already have yourself. Another point she made was a big step in cultivating wholeheartedness in a family. It's important to create a safe space at your home. So, sometimes we talk about home is the place where you can take your armor off. Like when you're out in the world, you have to be guarded up and protect your heart and protect your mind and, against the world and all the challenges that come your way. And when you come home, you should be able to just be, and not perform and not have to be a certain kind of way the world thinks you should be. You should just be able to be yourself. So she talks about the importance of creating a safe space in your home for you and for your child to just be imperfect, to just be. And so she says you can be imperfect, vulnerable, and safe here. That's what you're telling your child. That's the message you want to send. They don't have to perform. They don't have to always hit the mark. And also the same for yourself. So there's no need for a game face at home since you use it so much in the world. And at home, the message you're trying to send is you are enough no matter what kind of day you had. You are enough. She goes on to talk about worthiness in your family with a few other points and just says that, you want to make sure your child understands that worthiness in your eyes does not have prerequisites. So they can just come as they are. They don't have to be or perform or do a certain thing. So here's some points she made. Many of us have attached prereqs to worthiness. If and when, for example, if you do this, then. And so that's something to be careful about with when you're dealing with your child. And then she said, but it is about as if this is who I am. I know I am imperfect. As parents, what prereqs or worthiness are you knowingly and unknowingly handing down to your children? That's just something to think about. Are you putting requirements on your children that make them feel like they can't just be, they can't ever make a mistake, they can't just have a different opinion than yours, those kinds of things. The enemy of worthiness is shame, and we're going to dive into that next. There is a difference between shame and guilt, and then we're going to talk about what does that look like in your family? Do you see shame and guilt playing itself out in your family? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do you recognize that? And then how do you move away from that? So let's start with shame. You want to be aware if your child is kind of shame prone versus guilt prone. And the goal here is you want them to be more guilt prone than shame prone. Because shame prone is that kind of beat yourself up talk. Like, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, I'm crazy. That's shame. The guilt side of that is I made a mistake. I should have done this. You're acknowledging the issue, but you're not taking it on as your identity. So that's the big picture difference. So let's break that down a little bit. So shame is the belief that I am bad, I'm unworthy of love and belonging. There is something about us that we have done that is unlovable. Like you did something, you made a mistake, and nobody's going to love me now. Nobody's going to care about me now. That type of thing. Shame is saying to you that you don't deserve to be connected to others. You don't deserve to be loved by others. And then, like the point that was made in the previous chat, um, intergenerational parenting styles sometimes show up in shame because shame in previous generations and even this generation, sometimes that was how your parents tried to get you to behave. That's how they tried to correct your behavior. Like if you don't do this, then you won't have any friends, that kind of talk. If you're so messy, nobody's going to want to live with you. No one's going to want to marry you if you don't this, that kind of thing. So that type of shaming behavior is what we don't want. Children experience shame as a threat of being unloved, unlovable. So that's how they take that. When you're making those kind of comments, like if you don't, you're so messy, you're so, ugh, why are you so sloppy? I mean, like those kind of, even though they may be being messy, it's better to say, you're being messy right now. Or that was not a responsible decision. You can make better decisions than that. I believe in you. Like that's a little different tone than you're so irresponsible. You never make the right decisions. Like you just, just those kinds of, so it's a slight difference but the impact is very different. So it's not difficult to understand shame to turn their behaviors. Sometimes people use that to try to turn their behavior around. And it actually may work on the exterior. Like the child may actually try to do better and try to win your approval based on that shaming talk, but it is truly beating them down on the inside. And that may not even manifest immediately. It may manifest later. So, if we try to remove shame from our toolbox or parenting tools, our children will still go into the world and interact with people that may not share our goals or practice. So the point here is to say you might be doing all this great. I'm talking to them about guilt, like you made a mistake, own it, take responsibility, but you are not your mistake. You are still awesome, those kinds of things. And they may go into the world with teachers or coaches or clergy or friends and family and get that shame that you're not trying to put on them. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. You may say, I don't ever say things like that to my child. But are there teachers saying things like that? Are there friends? Are there other family members? So just being aware of that could be happening is really important. There's a difference in saying, I love who you are, but their choices and these behaviors are unacceptable. So just saying, I love you regardless, but I don't like your behavior. I don't like when you're mean or rude to people. Like that's not the best, that's not how we behave. That's not how we treat people, that kind of thing. So parenting is about making a journey with our children. We all know that we grow as parents every year, just like our children grow. Like I mentioned earlier, your parenting 5 years ago is probably not your parenting today because you have grown as a person. You've grown through the experiences you've had as a parent for your child or your children. You've gotten better. You've made mistakes. You've learned from them. And so you get to not shame yourself. You get to not say, oh, I'm a terrible parent. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just like you don't want someone to say that to your child, don't do that to yourself. Let's talk a little bit about guilt prone. Guilt is saying, I've done something bad. Great girl, really bad choice. So you're like, I made a mistake, but I am not a mistake. It's kind of that difference. So as parents, we want our children that rely heavily on guilt, self-talk rather than shame, self-talk. We want them to acknowledge when they make a mistake. We want them to kind of say, "Oh gosh, that wasn't the best way to handle that." You want that acknowledgement and that recognition, but you don't want them to take that on like, "I'm terrible. I should never have tried this." Like that type of thing. Like I made a mistake. I'm going to learn from it and move on. So parenting is a strong predictor of whether someone will show up being more shame or more guilt prone. Here's some few examples. How are we talking to our children? And the tricky part is, what's your tone? Sometimes you can be like, I'm saying the right words, but your tone is saying something completely different. So think about that. And then how we are engaging with our own shame in front of our children. So, like, say you drop something and you're like, oh, I'm so stupid. Or why do I keep doing dumb things? Like, like you are saying they're watching you all the time. So, depending on how you're talking to yourself, if you are shaming yourself, even if you're telling them, don't shame yourself, but they're watching you. So, they're going to learn from your example, and your example is way more powerful than your words. So, kind of keep that in mind. So now we're going to look at some other reflection questions here, talking about worthiness. So here's a couple of questions for worthiness, and then there's a couple for shame versus guilt. When it comes to worthiness, what do you do to cultivate worthiness in your child? What are 2 to 3 things that you can start doing to cultivate worthiness in your child? And then shame versus guilt. Did your parents use shame to parent you? Do you use shame or guilt in your own parenting style? Just something to think about for a little bit. All right. So thank you for taking some time to just reflect on these questions as you're thinking about your own parenting journey and what does parenting look like for you when it comes to making sure you have a create a space and send signals basically to your child that they are worthy no matter what, and help them to process through life and take more so the guilt prone, less than the shame prone perspective. So let's move on to talk about the topic of vulnerability. Vulnerability is huge in anything, right? Like we all are working parents, and sometimes you have to be a little vulnerable at work with your colleagues to help them to understand you and who you are and where you're coming from. By no means does that mean you have to tell them every deep, dark secret and everything that's going on with you in great detail, but sometimes being a little vulnerable and just letting people see us truly helps people understand us. And so that's the same thing with your children. As you're being vulnerable with your children, that helps them understand you, that helps them to connect with you. So when you think about a definition for vulnerability, it's kind of uncertainty, risk, it's emotional exposure. That's what makes it so challenging sometimes. And you may be the person that's like, oh, I'm good at being vulnerable. Or you may be the person that's like, nope, not me, keeping things to myself. Whichever space you take, with our point here of talking about the gifts of imperfect parenting, we're just saying one of the great things about being an imperfect parent and connecting with your child is the ability to be vulnerable with them and to teach them that it's okay, especially in a safe space that you create in your home, for them to be vulnerable with you. So, the most profound moments that we share with our children happen in vulnerability. The moments that shape who we are and who they are happen in vulnerability. When we show up together, take off our mask, and we are completely able to see and hear one another, when we feel safe enough to show up. And you kind of feel safe in safe spaces. And that takes time oftentimes. And then when children see vulnerability and not perfection in their parents, they tend to be good at it themselves. And they tend to be good at it when they become adults. It's important to let your child see you struggle and work through it. So if something's going on with work or any other kind of situation, just letting your child see, like, oh gosh, this is frustrating. Like, I'm really having a hard time with this, or oh, what am I going to do in this situation? They're seeing you vulnerable and they realize, oh, it's okay to struggle. It's okay to go through things. It's okay to deal with that's life. Like you don't have to fall apart. You can work through it. These people tend to be comfortable with uncertainty and discomfort when they see it growing up. So, when you see discomfort growing up and uncertainty, you see struggle, you think that's normal. And so you're like, okay, I'm not bad. I'm not terrible. I'm not going to fall apart because I'm having this uncomfortable or this challenging moment or circumstance in my life. This is part of life. I can get through this. I will work through this. So when you see your child struggle, we often want to fix it. And she makes a lot of good points about, when it comes to being vulnerable, it's okay sometimes to let the child feel the struggle because that helps them to learn how to work through it. And If you're in that mode of I have to be the perfect parent, you may be thinking I have to fix it. Everything has to be perfect. And I don't want them to struggle and I don't want them to have challenges. But it's important for them to learn because they have to be adults one day and, be able to work through things. So sometimes we need to just let them sit in the struggle. We need to fight the urge to fix it. Instead, sit with them and acknowledge the struggle and kind of just give them a hug and just listen and say, I'm so sorry. That sounds tough. It sounds like you had a bad day. I'm sorry to hear that. Hopefully today will be better. Tomorrow will be better. That kind of thing. And let them know it's okay. Here's some of points about vulnerability. How often do you share your own struggles with your children? Let them see you work through disappointment. And of course, this is talking age appropriate conversations, right? So obviously, if they're depending on their age, there's certain things is just not worth sharing because it's not appropriate for their age. But on an appropriate level, you can kind of let them see you struggle and work through things. When you're willing to be vulnerable with your children, you give them the opportunity to practice empathy and compassion. So you give them the opportunity to say, Mom, it'll be okay. I'm sorry. You sounds like you had a bad day, Mom. That sounds terrible. You're teaching them empathy for others because they get to practice on you. And that might sound a little odd, but that's how it goes. We all learn things at home before we leave home. So we got to think about that. And then be willing to own the emotions and help them own their own emotions. So, instead of that get over it mode, we want to be like, oh, I'm sorry, just kind of acknowledge the emotion, work through it, and then eventually you'll move on. How often do you share age appropriate way? And here's a little quote. Have you ever said, I don't care what anybody thinks? Can it really not matter? When we really stop caring about what people think, we lose our capacity for connection. And I thought that was a pretty interesting, different way of thinking about that. Like we could potentially lose our ability or capacity to connect with others when we harden ourselves to the point of saying, I don't care what anybody think. So that was kind of interesting one for me to think through a little bit. Here's another point from the book. It says, what we are teaching the child is more than what we say, so we must be what we want our children to become. So he's basically talking about actions speak louder than words. So here's another opportunity to reflect, and we'll do this for just maybe 5 minutes. And in this opportunity, here are the questions you're considering. How vulnerable are you with your child? Do you think you are perfect? Do they think you're perfect? Do they think you expect them to be perfect? Can you share an imperfect parenting moment that helped shape you as a parent? What have you learned about yourself in your imperfect parenting moments? And then how do you respond to your imperfect parenting moments? How do you respond? How do you rebound? Just something to think about for a moment. All right. So thank you for taking some time to reflect on your journey as a parent. And just the fact that it's so important to be vulnerable with our children and that they do watch us, they are watching us in our words and our actions. So this quote is just something to think. It's just a point to think about, really. If you had a special connection with an adult when you were a child, what was it about that relationship that made you feel special? And this always makes me think about my grandfather. And then recently I was thinking, it kind of makes me think about my mom, actually. My granddad as well, but my mom, who's still alive, thankfully. But my whole life, I think I've had a special connection with my mom. But when I think about as a child, my person that comes to mind is my granddaddy. So you may have a person that you had a special connection with, and maybe you have reasons for that. Maybe that person made you feel seen or heard, or they loved you no matter what. They encouraged you in some way. So, we all want to be that to our child. We want to be that to somebody's child, to other children, if we have nieces and nephews or neighbors or what have you. So it's just kind of a nice thought of who did you have a special connection with, and what was it about that person that allowed you to have that special connection? So, what we're talking about here, to wrap up, basically is just parenting. It is a progress. We're all on this continuum. We're just trying to do the best we can. So, here's some food for thought. It's important to reflect on how we were parented, not from a place of trying to shame our parents, but just from a place of understanding so that we can move forward and do better with our children. So if your parents use shame and now you recognize, oh, I'm doing the same thing, that's a good space to be in so that you can say, I don't want to use shame. I really want to just go that guilt prone where I'm saying, recognize your error, but don't beat yourself up about it. Don't live there, kind of move forward. And then what habits can you start today to improve and support your parenting progress? Like what can you do to help you do better? What can you do to continue to improve? What are some habits you can start to help your child be vulnerable with you? What can you do to help your child understand that they are worthy no matter what? Like what can you start doing? What can you stop doing? How can being vulnerable improve your relationship with your child? And I find that I sometimes have to intentionally share stories with my child. Like if some situation comes up and I'm pausing and I'm intentionally thinking of a story that relates to that situation, like maybe something they're dealing with, and I think, huh, you know what? When I was in sixth grade, this happened. And they're always so fascinated and interested in hearing these stories. And it's always a story where I made a mistake or I had a challenge or struggle or what have you. And that helps them to connect with me and actually understand that I get where you're coming from. I may not be you right now, but I've had struggles as well. And like I got over it and you can get through it as well. So it just, kind of, I've been doing it a lot lately, trying to be like, okay, it's easy to say, it'll be fine. I'm sorry you had a bad day. But then when you tell a story that they can relate to, it helps them to connect to you. And so here's what we're going to talk about next time. If you can join us next week, we're going to be talking about perfectionism, love and belonging, hopefulness, and a sense of hope. And this slide just kind of reminds you if you're not aware of our resources that we offer in the Office of Work Life here at the University of Kentucky. We have quite a few ongoing workshops. We have monthly workshops, monthly informal real talks. We do have some upcoming workshops you might be interested in checking out. This Friday, we have one talking about the fatherhood journey. Play is good for you, it's good for them as well. We have a speed friending opportunity coming up, parent circle, and a brown bag, which will be in person on campus later this semester. So just want to make sure you're aware of some of our upcoming opportunities and how we serve you and how we support you here at the University of Kentucky. Thank you so much for joining us for today's workshop. We look forward to seeing you for part two of being an imperfect parent.